Hello, my name is Michael McCabe and I'm the CEO of Intelligence Fusion, and I'm joined by Max Taylor, our Senior Regional Analyst for Asia, who regularly looks at the Middle East. And on today's podcast, we're going to look in detail at the assassination of Qassem Soleimani. Now, we picked up on the incident just after 10:30 p.m. on the 2nd of January, and it was identified by our 24/7 Operations Centre. At Intelligence Fusion, we swarm major incidents such as this, and what I mean by that is that as a company, we gather as much information as we can as quickly as possible so that our subscribers can take appropriate response measures if they feel they're going to be impacted by that incident. So, Max, I think the first question is, who is Qassem Soleimani?
So Soleimani was an Iranian major general in the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps' Quds Force, and the Quds Force is part of and slightly separate to the IRGC, and he's been involved in coordinating Iranian policy with Iranian-backed militias overseas in countries such as Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. He's become an incredibly powerful man, not only within these proxy militias of Iran, but within Iranian politics himself, and he's both loved and hated by Iranians throughout Iran.
So do we know how and when he became the Quds Force commander?
So there's some unknowns here, but he joined the IRGC in 1979, immediately after the Iranian Revolution, and his first posting was in northwestern Iran early on, and he took part in the suppression of a Kurdish separatist uprising in West Azerbaijan province. Shortly after that, in the Iran-Iraq war, he served as a company commander, where he allegedly served with distinction, and as a result, he became commander of the 34th Sarala Division. In the 1990s, he was moved to Kerman province, where he remained an IRGC commander and was actively involved in fighting drugs trafficking coming from Afghanistan and Pakistan. The exact date of when he became commander of the Quds Force isn't actually clear. It's believed to be somewhere between 1997 and 1998. And after that, following the 9/11 attacks in 2001, he was actively involved in collaboration between the USA and the Iranian government in fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan. And this took place during a brief period when both Iran and USA's foreign policy goals in Afghanistan were aligned. Unfortunately, it didn't last long. And in the 2002 speech made by President George W. Bush, Soleimani was labelled as part of the axis of evil, and the collaboration between USA and Iran effectively broke down after that.
So what about more recent activity of the past 20 years, since 2002? What's he been doing?
More recently, he's continued to form relationships with often Shia militias across the Middle East, such as Hezbollah, PMF brigades in Iraq, and groups in Syria as well as the Houthi rebels in Yemen. His involvement is always, as you expect, quite unclear, so exactly what he does on a day-to-day basis, but generally he's been instrumental in creating these very strong relationships between these militias by supplying both weapons, money, and at times personnel to these militia brigades across the Middle East. And it's these militia brigades that we're seeing in the news more and more often, the PMF brigades in Iraq in particular, which Soleimani's fomented a very strong relationship with.
The PMFs are, they're quite interesting because they were quite key in removing Islamic State and their significant control of Iraq. So, do you want to just give us a bit more information regarding them and perhaps a bit about how they were involved in the defeat of Islamic State?
Yeah, so I'll start with how they fought the Islamic State. So the PMF were essentially a militia organisation that fought alongside Iraqi security forces, and in many cases they were actually believed to be more reliable than the Iraqi security forces themselves. So they fought with most of the time with distinction against IS, and at times alongside US personnel, or at least in close coordination with US personnel, leading to a really interesting situation in which you had Iranian and American forces essentially working with the same group. But the PMF itself is an umbrella term really for its popular mobilization forces, and it's an umbrella term for a plethora of militias from various backgrounds across Iraq that have all come together to form the PMF. So whilst they are bound together by the name of the PMF and by some organisational similarities, generally these militias are quite separate, and they often work very separately to each other. So most of the militias are Shia, and therefore naturally tend to fall under the Iranian influence. But you've also got Sunni militias from Sunni parts of Iraq, as well as certain Christian militias as well. So it's a very mixed group, and each militia has often got different backers, whether they be individuals or state backers.
It's interesting, in recent years with Iraq, there's been many militias that have formed. So in Anbar province, you had the Anbar Awakening, you had the Sons of Iraq, who actually formed to remove Al-Qaeda from Anbar province. Now, there was a real worry by Prime Minister Maliki at the time that you had these unregulated, uncontrolled Sunni militias that were operating, and he actually felt that they were a threat to himself. Now, they were receiving salaries from the Iraqi government. However, often they were being ignored or under supported by the Iraqi government because Maliki felt that they were a real threat to his own power. Now, the Sons of Iraq were eventually targeted so much that they just became a spent force. Now, following on from that and the rise of Islamic State, we now actually have the PMFs who've grown, and they've been used to actually, with the support of Iran, to actually combat Islamic State. So they're in a really unusual position where I'd imagine they're quite highly regarded in Iraqi society because of what they've done against Islamic State.
Yes, exactly. So recent US strikes against PMF commanders, for example, have been met with very mixed reactions, in that it's often framed, particularly by international politicians from other countries, as the USA is attacking a force which is actively fighting the Islamic State, which isn't strictly untrue, but it's worth remembering here that the PMF is a number of forces, so it's a more nuanced outlook on this issue is certainly needed, because yes, these PMF militias are fighting Islamic State, but also yes, some of these PMF militias are directly involved with other known terror groups or human rights abuses, etc., etc. So it's a very complicated question.
Mm-hmm. So Qassem Soleimani was assassinated, and he was the leader of the Quds Force. So can you just flesh out a bit more exactly who the Quds Force are?
Yes, so the Quds Force is a specialised unit within the IRGC, so they're not actually the IRGC itself, and the Quds Force specialises in unconventional warfare outside of the Iranian borders. So it's generally used to carry out insurgency-style tactics in countries such as Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and in Lebanon, where Quds Force activity is well known. And the Quds Force has at its strongest believed to have an overall strength of about 10,000 to 20,000 personnel, and using these personnel is been supplemented by domestic militias from the countries within which it operates. Controversially, in April 2019, the Quds Force was actually designated a foreign terrorist organisation by the United States, and multiple other Western governments and some Middle Eastern governments followed suit shortly after. And this designation as a terrorist organisation has significantly altered the relationship between Iran and the USA, and it came at a time when the nuclear talks were very much on the agenda, and it was seen as, by some, degrading the talks.
So we've mentioned the PMF, we've mentioned the Quds Force. Now, one of the other people who were actually targeted last night was Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. Now, can you just run us through exactly who he is?
Yeah, so al-Mohandes he's quite interesting. He's an interesting character. So he's an Iraqi-Iranian politician and a military commander, which is common in the region. He's been a deputy commander of the PMF, and so which is why he was one of those targeted in the strikes. And the PMF unit he's been commanding is known as the Kataib Hezbollah group. And they've been targeted before, but they've also been responsible before in attacks against US assets. And they were blamed for a casualty at a US base in Kirkuk province at the K1 military base when rockets were fired. And immediately after, Kataib Hezbollah were then targeted by airstrikes. So Mohandes himself was actually found guilty in the past of terror offences, and he was found to be involved in the 1983 bombings of the US and French embassies in Kuwait. And this accusation caused him to relocate from Iraq to Iran, and he stayed there until the withdrawal of US troops in 2011. So he's heavily under the influence of Iranian military and governmental power. More recently still, he's been involved in advising the Iranian Quds Force, and that's very much brought him within the sphere of influence of Qassem Soleimani, and has aided in the increase of Iranian influence across Iraq via the PMF militias. So,
I mean, you can't talk about the PMFs and talk about Shia militias Iranian influence without actually talking about the Badr organization. Now, I was reading an article before about the PMF, and there was an interesting line which stated that Badr is the heart of the PMF, but not its head, which is actually Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, who was actually assassinated last night. So Badr, for those who don't know, the Badr Brigade was an Iran-officered military wing of the Iran-based Shia Islamic Party, the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution of Iraq, or SCIRI, and it was formed in 1982. Now, the Badr organization is now an official Iraqi political party, but it's also been felt that with the rise of the PMFs, Badr has lost some of its prominence, and by association, so has its leader, Hadi al-Amiri. Now, meanwhile, with the rise of the PMF, we've seen personalities like Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes who have actually came to greater prominence. And it should also be known that with Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, the actual current chairman of the PMF, Fali al-Fayyad, he was one of the people who actually led the demonstration against the US Embassy in Baghdad on the 31st December 2019, despite him meeting the US Defense Secretary Mark Esper in Washington on the 2nd of October 2019. So just on that, and this sort of recent escalation in tit-for-tat attacks, can you just run us through a timeline of the recent attacks in Iraq which actually led to Qassem Soleimani's assassination?
Yeah, so this morning's attack wasn't an isolated incident. In fact, it was the latest incident in a series of events which have taken place over the last 10 days in the short-term focus. So the first of which in this 10-day period was on the 27th of December when rockets were fired at the K1 US military base in Kirkuk province. And in this attack, a US contractor and an Iraqi police officer were killed, and multiple other casualties were also reported. And the Iran-backed Kataib Hezbollah militia was instantly blamed for the attack. Now, the strong Iranian influence within Kataib Hezbollah essentially meant that whilst the Hezbollah group were responsible for the attack, Iran was essentially to blame for it. So hence, on the 29th of December, US airstrikes targeted 5 Iran-backed militia positions in the Syria-Iraq border area. Now, this was in direct response to the attack we just spoke about on the 27th of December. And these airstrikes, which there were 5 locations targeted, these airstrikes targeted the Kataib Hezbollah militia due to their involvement in the earlier attack, but also in this attack, multiple Iranian regular military personnel are also believed to have been killed.
So can we just touch on that one there, because the airstrikes, I believe, occurred, 3 of which in the area of Al-Qaim, and then the other 2 were across the border in Syria. Now, this is an area which is it's gone from Islamic State control to Iraqi security force control. So now you've got Iranian forces there. So just a quick summary: what's in recent years exactly what's been happening there, and why we've gone from Islamic State to then having sort of Iraqi security force and now Iranian military personnel actually positioned there. What's been going on in that Al-Qaim area?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting region actually. And Al-Qaim is right on the border between Syria, Syria's Deir ez-Zor province and Iraq's Anbar province. So the reason we've got Iranian militias with such a strong influence there is because the Iranian militias played such a pivotal role in fighting Islamic State in that part of Anbar. Now, on the other side, in the Syrian border, Deir ez-Zor province is very much split in 2. So you've got on the western side of the Euphrates is Syrian government and associated militia control. And on the eastern side of the Euphrates, you've got Syrian Democratic Kurdish Forces control. So as a result, on the Syrian government side of the Euphrates, on the Syrian side of the border, there is a huge number of Iranian-backed militias operating in this area. And some of these militias are also from Iraqi PMF units who have moved into Syria, thus further expanding Iranian influence in this part. So since Islamic State has been defeated and their last stronghold was found just on the other side of the border to Al-Qaim, since Islamic State has been defeated, you've now got essentially what's left is the forces that fought them, and that's mostly Iran-backed militias with Syrian government presence as well as in parts of the Syrian side of the border, Kurdish SDF forces. And that's why we're seeing this large presence of Iranian forces there.
There was an interesting footage, I think, last year, which came out, and it showed Qassem Soleimani stood on the Iraq-Syrian border in Anbar province, surrounded by PMFs, which just showed the extent of the Iranian reach, which stretched through Iraq and into Syria. So the recent instance that we've seen as part of this timeline, so on the 31st December, can you just flesh out a bit more regarding the US Embassy and exactly what happened there?
Yeah, so we've just spoken about the 27th of December, the rockets at US base. 29th of December was airstrikes in the Syria-Iraq border region. And on the 31st of December, a very large group of protesters attempted to storm the US Embassy in Baghdad in the international zone. The protest was mostly carried out by members of Iran-backed militias and supporters of these militias. and was seen as very separate to the rest of the protests that have been taking place in Baghdad for the last few months. Now, the protesters entered the international zone with relative ease, set fire to some of the outbuildings of the US embassy, and were seen gaining entry past the first security gate at the embassy. So this was quite a major incident, and the torching of these US buildings was no doubt a significant provocation. And Iran was, as we mentioned, was immediately blamed for orchestrating this protest, as most of these protesters were Iran-backed militias, and it was a very staunchly pro-Iran protest. So this was seen as an act of provocation, and in response, and it's believed that in response to this, on January 3rd, so this morning, the US drones targeted 2 vehicles, killing Qassem Soleimani and a series of other IRGC commanders and PMF commanders. So the most recent attack this morning, with this in mind, has been the latest in a series of attacks. It's very much a sequence in which one side targets the other, and the other side responds, and then there's a response and a response and a response. So at some point, someone's going to have to break the cycle.
And it's a significant escalation, isn't it? Because, the US embassy, they built that embassy in Baghdad at a cost of something like $750 million. And that was to be their long-term presence in the Middle East. And here we are, just a few years after that embassy's been completed, and you have PMF protesters literally banging on the windows of the embassy. And then obviously that's then led to an assassination of the Quds Force. So just regarding that assassination, can you just tell us about the attack details and exactly what happened?
Yeah, so this was a really important attack in that it killed an Iranian commander, from a high-ranking Iranian commander as well as other PMF commanders who have been targeted in the past. So with that in mind, as you said, it was a significant escalation. Now, the attack itself took place just outside of Baghdad International Airport on the perimeter as the convoy of 2 vehicles left the airport. Soleimani and his entourage had just arrived in Baghdad, believed to have been from Damascus, although some people have claimed Beirut too, which are both countries where the Iranians have significant influence in local militias. Initial reports did actually claim that the strike was carried out by gunships, but later reporting that came out a few hours after the attack itself started to come to a consensus that they were in fact carried out by US drones rather than gunships. And but what makes it so interesting about a drone strike in such a populated area was it's also its proximity to the airport. This attack was very much made to make a statement. The USA wanted to let the Iranians know, or we believe that wanted to let the Iranians know, that they were tracking Soleimani. They knew his location, and they knew exactly where he'd been. This was clearly an attack that had been quite a long time in planning, to some extent. Obviously, we can't speculate about US intelligence, but there's no doubt that this stands out from previous attacks more for the sheer significance of it and the targets involved who were killed in this strike.
There's a certain level of irony here when you see that it actually occurred on what was known as Route Irish, which at the time was considered to be the most dangerous route in the world. And often the devices that were being used against US forces and contractors were believed to have been coming from Iran. So the fact that the Quds Force commander actually was killed on Route Irish, there's a certain level of irony that I'm sure isn't lost on many analysts. So before we actually go into the impact of this incident, can you just run us through what the current situation is in Iraq? Because I think that has a bearing on how this is actually going to be felt going forward.
Yeah, so despite claims that Islamic State's been defeated, there's still an incredibly prominent threat in Iraq. And I think Iraqi security, with this in mind, can be split into 2 main themes. So the first is the ongoing protests, and the second is the presence of Islamic State and the consequent fighting. So I'll start with the fighting against the Islamic State, just to lay a ground view, I guess, of what we've been seeing in Iraq on a daily basis. So there's fighting usually involving Islamic State militias in most of the northern provinces. It's quite rare to report Islamic State presence in the south. Much of the fighting takes place in the Diyala province, and it's often in the form of sniper attacks on exposed checkpoints, IEDs on security forces' vehicles, and occasional skirmishes. And Islamic State has also manipulated and intimidated villages in these areas, such as Anbar, Diyala, Salahuddin, and Kirkuk, and where they've tried to intimidate villagers. So they've collected tax from them, and if the villagers have refused to pay this tax to IS militants, they've burnt their crops, or they've killed relatives, or they've fired mortars at the village. And what this shows is, okay, yes, Islamic State has less presence than it used to back, say, in 2015, but they still are a significant threat. And the issue that we're seeing is that Iraqi security forces are struggling to combat this threat. So you have villagers leaving their homes because they don't trust the Iraqi security forces to protect them from the Islamic State militias in the area. So that's one aspect of the broader theme of Iraqi security.
I mean, that whole extortion side of it from Islamic State is interesting, because when they lost their oil fields and their revenues from that, they then turned to extortion. So, we'd see car dealerships being targeted with IDs, and we'd be looking at it thinking, well, why has that occurred? And what we were finding is that they were being extorted by Islamic State. It was a case of, right, either pay us this money or else you're going to be attacked with an ID. So it's really interesting that whole extortion and the revenue that they make from it.
Absolutely. The loss of the oil revenues, particularly in Syria, was a huge loss to the Islamic State, and they, unlike a lot of groups, they were able to monetize a lot of the territory they captured. So yes, as you said, they've resorted to extortion, which they've always done, to be fair, but now it's becoming much more important to them as their sources of money is rapidly drying up. And the other theme I wanted to touch on was the protests which we've seen in Iraq more recently. And these protests are quite an interesting theme in that they've taken place in mostly Shia cities in the south of Iraq and in Baghdad itself. And but with this in mind, they've actually had a very strong anti-Iranian sentiment to them. So essentially they've become almost nationalist protests in which you've got both Shia and at times Sunni protesters joining in to protest against foreign interference in their country. So these protests have been quite violently repressed by Iraqi security forces, and a lot of the discourse around these protests from the protests themselves has accused the Iranians of being behind this. So every time there's been fatalities and the suppression of protests, a lot of protesters have very quickly accused the Iranians of getting their own militias to violently repress protests. And bearing in mind that many of these protests are against Iranian influence in Iraq, this has had a very negative impact on Iranian soft power in Iraq itself. It shouldn't be assumed that these southern Shia cities will support Iran in any interference within Iraq itself. But at the same time, it's important to remember here that the protests weren't just because they're anti-Iran doesn't mean they're pro-USA. There were cases when they're burning USA flags alongside Iranian flags. And so the lesson to be taken from this is whilst these protests are anti-Iran, they are generally more anti-international involvement whatsoever. A lot of these young Iraqis are quite tired of international interference in their country at a time of economic hardship.
So is this a resurgence in Iraqi nationalism, and what is the reason for that? And the reason I ask that is because within the Sunni provinces that I'm well versed with, of Anbar as an example, you used to have nationalist organizations, groups like Hamas al-Iraq and Jaish Rajal al-Tariq al-Naqshbandi. Now, when Islamic State became prominent, those groups seem to sort of reduce in their profile, and I think part of it from my research was that part of them were kind of forced to actually then operate and work with Islamic State to an extent. Now Islamic State are now actually gone. Are we now seeing an increase in nationalism off the back of that threat is now gone? So there are now other things for them to think about, or what's the reason for that Iraqi nationalism and this sort of seeming resurgence?
So it's actually a really interesting question about the relationship between nationalism and radical Islamism in Iraq. As you said, a lot of these potentially more nationalist militant groups were absorbed in the end by Islamic State because their appeal was just lost at a time when secular tensions between Shia and Sunni were very, very severe. So potentially it's hard to generalize these protests, as it does appear that in every city there is a more nuanced reasoning for each protest. But yeah, I'd agree. It does seem that there does seem to be an increase in nationalist feeling in the face of foreign interference in Iraq itself. And this, in combination with a woefully underperforming Iraqi government, both economically and politically, has meant that you've got vast swathes of young, educated, often very, very intelligent Iraqi youths out of work. And that's really fed to these protests. So you have a really interesting mix of, yes, there is still some secular feeling there. There's a lot of nationalist feeling, often in response to these international actors being involved in Iraqi politics, as well as just more standard issues related across the globe, such as poor levels of employment and poor economic performance.
So there's dissent. There is a youth who are suffering economically. So with that in mind, what's going to be the impact of this assassination?
This is again a incredibly difficult question, and I think has to be approached more at an international level as well as at a domestic level. So at an international level, it seems likely that Iran will respond in some way in kind. In the past, Iran has generally responded to similar tit-for-tat attacks with rocket attacks at bases, and they fired 1 or 2 what are called Katyusha rockets at a US base. Generally, these don't cause casualties, although the most recent one did. But they're more to make a statement, they're more to make a political statement, and just generally try and create a feeling of insecurity among US assets. However, as we've mentioned already, this latest attack was quite significant in that it directly targeted a high-ranking Iranian general. And I feel like this has, in some ways, forced Iran into quite a tricky position, because they can't brush this off, because the media has made so much of this attack, including Iranian media, to not respond in a more significant way would show Iranian weakness. So I do feel that Iran is going to try and make a statement in some way, shape or form. Exactly how they're going to do this isn't quite clear. So there's been a lot of speculation about this so far, whether it will be in Iraq itself or will it be through a proxy, perhaps in Lebanon or Yemen. It seems unlikely that Hezbollah in Lebanon is going to make an attack on Israel, as both Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon very much have their own issues that they're dealing with. They're very much, and Hezbollah does tend to have a bit more agency in what it does, and it's a little bit more independent from Iran than certain Iraqi militias. However, with that said, the Yemeni Houthi rebel group have vowed retaliation after this attack, and in the past they've made no secret that they've fired drones into Saudi territory to target major oil refineries or military bases. So Yemen is a potential flashpoint where this could, where retaliation could manifest itself. But also in Iraq itself, I think we're going to see Iranian forces via proxies attempting to target US personnel in Iraq.
I think it brings in a more wider question of the whole use of proxies and asymmetric warfare. Now, what President Trump has done with this action is he's basically said that you are going to be held accountable for your actions, which is interesting. And I don't think we can't emphasize enough just how significant this action is. It's essentially taking out the number 2 person in Iran. So it's quite worrying as to how this may escalate, especially if we see tit-for-tat retaliatory escalating actions. So in terms of most likely course of action and most dangerous course of action, what would be your most likely course of action?
I think most likely course of action from Iran, I think, would be targeting of US assets via rocket attacks or potentially seizure of another ship in the Straits of Hormuz area, where Iran has done so in the past. These are quite easy options for Iran in that they've done it in the past and they've come off relatively lightly in respects to what they did. And also they can claim plausible deniability in the forms of rocket attacks, in that what I mean by this is they can fire rockets at US base, and whilst the US can accuse Iran of carrying out the attack, and Iran very well may have carried out the attack, it's very hard to actually 100% prove that Iran carried out the attack. Obviously, as we were saying earlier though, the most dangerous form of retaliation, I think, is just as likely as maybe cruise missile attacks or ballistic missile attacks on US assets, as we've seen the Houthi rebels have attempted to do into Saudi Arabia. This would, in my opinion, display a more intent from the Iranians and would tick the boxes for the Iranians in that they come across as making a significant escalation in their own response attacks to US attacks. Because what the Iranians don't really want to be seen doing here is not responding in kind to what is being seen as a major escalation.
So let's just look at the global reaction to the assassination. What's been said?
The global reaction, as you can expect, has been quite mixed. Those that are currently siding with the USA have generally supported it and highlighted Soleimani's involvement in human rights abuses, in illegal activity, and as well as military activity abroad. So countries such other Western countries have generally been quite supportive of this. Some European countries have called for restraint and generally just asked both parties to calm down, but they haven't necessarily gone as far to condemn the attack. Iran obviously has condemned the attack, as have Russia, which you would expect. Russia and Iran have become increasingly close in the last few years, particularly in Syria, even though there is still some differences between them. China took a more nuanced approach, and China did go as far to essentially condemn the attack, but also called for restraint from both sides. So the Chinese are reluctant to get involved in any Middle Eastern quagmires, and as a result, this can be seen in their response in that they've generally taken quite a generic response and just called for both sides to calm down. And
I saw that Iran's National Security Council has called this an act of war. Looking more locally, what's the local context?
The way this attack has been perceived at a local context, again, is quite it completely varies depending on what sort of person you're asking. I've noticed in my own work, looking at the reactions online in Iraqi media, a lot of the Iraqi protesters that we've seen out on the streets in the last few months, some of them support the attack, because most of them, at the end of the day, as we said earlier, they are protesting against Iranian influence in Iraq. So some of them do in some way support the attack, and some do oppose the attack as well, because they oppose the concept of the USA being able to carry out strikes in Iraq how and when they want. But at the end of the day, I've noticed that all these especially young Iraqis on social media have generally come to the consensus that any confrontation between Iran and USA is probably going to be played out in Iraq, and it's going to be bad news for Iraqi citizens who generally just want to be left alone. So in Iraq itself, it does seem to have met quite a negative audience. I think this could be expected, because many now fear the likely, almost probable escalation that's going to come from this. Iranian forces, I think, are probably looking to avoid direct military confrontation with the USA. The Iranians have said a few times in the past that they're not actually looking for war. Although with that said, rhetoric coming out of the military defense spokespeople isn't to be looked in too far. With that, I think the Iranians therefore probably going to carry on taking this proxy warfare approach to it rather than conventional war, despite, as you just mentioned, despite them claiming that this was an act of war. They've claimed this in the past, and they've also threatened direct conflict in the past. So I think it's important not to look too far into this. So a lot of people are quite worried that this will start a third world war. There's no point really speculating on that, because history suggests that major conflicts tend to come out of the smallest of flashpoints. And whilst this could be that small flashpoint, it doesn't necessarily mean that therefore there will be war. It seems currently fairly improbable that both sides are going to commit tanks on the ground, aircraft, conventional style conflict, like what we saw in 1939. So personally, I'm thinking both sides are quite content to stick with this proxy conflict, albeit at the top end of proxy conflict, bordering on conventional conflict.
I mean, especially when you look at Iran and just how much their sphere of influence has increased over the last decade, from Iran through to Iraq, into Syria and into Lebanon, it makes no sense that they would want to have a hot war with the US, particularly because of the technology that the US can bring militarily against them. So finally then, what's the impact of this attack on US interests in the country?
It's a good question, actually. The US embassy in Baghdad instantly recognized the increased threat that this incident has put US personnel under. And straight after the drone strike on Qassem Soleimani, there was a notice put out that all US civilian staff and all US oil workers in the country to leave immediately via flight if possible, but over land routes if flights being cancelled. So that's a clear recognition that US and personnel in Iraq are at significant risk of being kidnapped, abducted for political reasons. This also, in my opinion, should be applied to Western workers as well. It's Western staff may obviously then, their countries may be at times denouncing or not necessarily pulling the line of US policy, but regardless, Western NGO staff, oil company staff, security officials, etc., still are a very easy, low-hanging fruit style target for Iranians to abduct or kidnap. I think from a business perspective in Iraq, obviously with staff now being a significant threat, this is a major incident and should be seen as so. So not only are your staff at a significant threat of kidnapping, we have to look at the broader themes as well. For example, what's happened to the price of oil since this attack? Predictably, it's risen quite significantly as uncertainty grows. Military companies, private military companies, obviously who are involved in protecting embassies. Again, the US embassy siege showed a significant threat to embassies, particularly Western embassies in the international zone, and perhaps highlighted that Iraqi security forces cannot always be relied on, particularly when incidents are highly politicized, such as those protests we saw at the US embassy.
So looking forward, it seems likely that the Iranian government and the armed forces will agree on some form of response over the next 24-hour period and possibly conduct that response during the next 24 to 72 hours. And the consequence of that decision, I guess, is going to be exactly how the response will be carried out and exactly what negative security ramifications that will have for the region. So thanks very much, Max. So if you'd like to book a demonstration of Intelligence Fusion, then you can book online with the link in the comment section. And subscribers to Intelligence Fusion will get real-time 24/7 alerts regarding any updates to this incident.